Makahanya haramita shingyo genji saiboza gyojin hanya haramita jishoken gon gai gudo isai gu yaku shariji.
Welcome back to our series of talks on the 10 bull herding pictures, the bull and its herdsman. We've now reached picture number 7, and this one is entitled Bull Forgotten, Man Remains. And, well, it's fairly descriptive of the picture. Once again, we now have a picture with no bull in it. But we do have our little man there as well. But this is a very different type of picture to the ones that we had at the beginning, because obviously those first two pictures, also there was just the herdsman. And there was no bull, at least none apparently. And we almost seem to have gone back to this. And in a way this is mirrored in a famous Zen saying that says, in the beginning, the mountains are the mountains and the trees are the trees. And then after a time, the mountains are no longer the mountains and the trees are no longer the trees. And then again, at the end, the mountains are once against the mountains and the trees are again the trees. And one person once asked, well, what's the difference then? I mean, if we start with mountains are mountains and we end up with mountains are mountains, then what's been gained really? And the reply came back, said, well, in the beginning, you have that little baby who, being quite open and fresh and new, and not with the usual aggregations of attachments, and particularly attachment to a sense of self, because very young babies don't really have that. Yes, there is that innocence, that purity, that straightforwardness. But the problem is that when the child's hungry, it yells, it can't bear it. Whereas the one at the very end, although experiencing life in that purity, in that real openness and warmth of heart, now the heart is gentle, it's not elemental. And this is really the difference now between that first and that last. In the beginning, those powers, as we've been discussing in the previous talks, are elemental. They're not inhuman, they are ahuman. This is what we are born with. But they have not been humanized, and we've now undergone a long process of humanization. And we've now come to the point where those powers have been integrated into that human nature. Because we remember the herdsman represented that form, that human nature. And the bull represented the elemental forces that had somehow become estranged. Those two things had become apart, and now they've been fully integrated. We've seen this process of gradually coming together, and now in this picture it's fully integrated. And my goodness, what a difference it makes. In that first picture we had the herdsman in a wilderness, and although it looked pretty, actually it was hostile. It was experienced as hostile, which is how we experience the elemental forces that are in the world and that are in our own nature. We project them outwards, and we feel the world as hostile because it comes up and it suddenly does terrible things to us, and we feel that we can't fully protect ourselves from it. Things like old age, things like loss, things like death, things like anything that's unpleasant, anything that doesn't unsuit me frightens me. But here now we've got a quite different landscape. Here now we've got something that looks, well, actually quite mysterious. In the far distance there we can see the mountain, and close to it, shining above that mountain is, or slightly to one side, is the moon. And that moon, that full moon, in the Eastern scheme, represents that fully awakened heart. The moon obviously reflects the sun's rays, and that full moon, complete, round, represents the awakened heart. And we often see the moon, actually, if we have a look at, for example, at the Buddha's death picture, the parinirvana picture. You'll see usually at the very top of that picture there's also a full moon, which also represents that fully awakened heart. This heart is not something that is mine. We need to be careful. This is not something that's mine. It goes way beyond that. This is something quite mysterious now. And we are truly entering into the realm of the religious. And this is why in the foreground we see that our little man is kneeling with his hands together in gasho, in that traditional worldwide gesture of prayer, of reverence to something greater than himself, and he looks up as well. With that, the whole gesture, the whole posture shows that reverence. And next to him there is a house, and we can see that the door curtain is drawn back, and that house is empty. And this, of course, represents the heart, or the body, and the mind. It's now completely empty of all wanting this or not wanting that. It is open, it is settled, because it is at peace with and content with the things as they are, and fully accepting. It's not frightened anymore. There's no fear there. There's in that empty house. If you have nothing in that empty house, then there's nothing that can be lost. Things can come in to the house and things can go out. And this is the same in our practice too. In that deep state, in that open state, then whatever comes into this house, that is the body. Whatever the sensations, whatever the thoughts, whatever the feeling, simply comes in. We face it. We don't turn our back on it or try to get rid of it. And after a while, it goes away again. I remember there was one of the forest-dwelling monks, Ajahn Chah, described meditation thus. He said, it is as if on the edge of a great forest there is a pool, a large pool, and in the background behind there are the trees, and there's the darkness underneath the tree canopies. You cannot see in there. But all the animals, all the inhabitants of the forest at some point or other will come out of that forest, and they will come and they will bathe and they will drink, and they will stay for a while, and then they will go back into the forest. And some of those creatures we know, and some of those creatures we don't know, and some of them look strange, and some of them even may look quite frightening, but all of them do exactly the same. They come, they stay for a while, and then they simply recede back into the dark canopy of the forest. And this really very nicely expresses that mood, that attitude that is cultivated in our mindfulness and meditation practices, is that openness. But yet neither can it fall into quietism. That's also warned about too in the teachings. This sort of standing apart, being cool, and then falling into the danger of becoming aloof. Because to become aloof means to become cut off from human feeling, to become cut off from that warmth of heart. And that is a danger too. The Swiss psychologist Carl Gustav Jung tells a story that he heard about a Swiss verger who was truly a man of the church, and over his years he became more and more serious, more and more dour, more and more serious, until eventually, in his own words, he became nothing but a lowering pillar of the church. And then one night, his wife woke up with a start to find him sitting bolt upright next to her, laughing his head off and exclaiming, "Well, well, well, after all, I'm nothing but an old scoundrel." And after that, he began to live it up, which psychologically would of course balance him out, but is somewhat difficult for the poor old wife who now had to live with him in this new mode. So perhaps it's better not to let those two sides become to drift too far apart. In fact, to allow those to come together in that roundness of human life, where we have the light and the dark together. and within the precepts, obviously, as well. So we have that empty house. There's nothing obstructed. No, there's no preferences in there anymore. And this now encapsulates that inner landscape of our man. And there he is in that gesture, the bull having now been fully integrated, and now the path to something a little bit different has opened up to that great mystery. And of course, the truth is we love mysteries. So perhaps for a lot of people come into Zen, you know, we sort of read a few koans, or we read a few of exchanges between as the Zen masters and their students, and we're intrigued. We want to know, what's this all about? What does it mean? I don't like it when I don't understand something, when I feel somewhat left out. And so that increases the pull to really want to understand. And in one sense, that's a good thing, because it draws us into the path, and it takes us and carries us along the path. And it inspires us too, there's no doubt about it. But in fact, we have to be careful, because the spiritual is not some nice, fluffy, sort of floating around 6 inches off the ground on a cloud of unknowing type of thing. It can be harrowing. It can be terrifying if it's encountered too quickly. And so a good training softens up softens up the trainee, softens up the stiff-necked eye, because otherwise, if that revelation comes in too quickly, it can shatter the vessel. And it's rather like the old story of the from Egypt, of the priest of Isis, the young acolyte. And as is quite traditional in much deity worship, East and West, the deity is often veiled, or kept within a cabinet, or in some kind of inner sanctum or holy of holies, and only the chief priest or priestess could go in and witness the deity in all his or her splendor. And the same was true in the temple of Isis. There was the statue of Isis, and it was always kept behind a curtain. No one could see it. Everyone came in to worship and make their offerings, but no one could gaze upon the bare face of the lady. We think of also of Actaeon and Diana, that fable too, what happens to him. But the young acolyte was desperate. He wanted to know. He couldn't bear not knowing. And so one night he crept in to the temple, and there he lifted the curtain. And the story ends in one of two ways. Either that the following morning he was found dead, or that he was found a gibbering, insane idiot. That it had completely deranged his mind, and he never recovered from it. Anyway, it ends badly. That's the point. Well, we can make of this what we will, but there is a very valid point there. If it's easy to be overcome, actually, by something, and certainly that tendency of I to want to grasp hold of something, to concretize the mystery. We cannot. In one sense, we're fascinated and drawn by that sense of something mysterious. On the other hand, I'm desperate to get hold of it. But this is the curious thing. I mean, we perhaps one of the most popular genres of books are, thrillers and whodunits. Some mysterious thing is set up, and then in the last few pages, it's all revealed. And there's always a sort of anticlimax with it. It's never quite as good as the mystery itself. And in that sense, we want to then go on to the next mystery. And we want that to be revealed. And when it is revealed again, it never quite lives up to it, or very, very rarely does it live up to it. And then we want to go on to the next thing after that. Because I cannot live just with that sense of the presence of mystery. And of course, the Buddha nature is mysterious, completely mysterious. We bandy this word round, Buddha nature, and things like enlightenment and Buddha, but we don't really know what they mean. We project all sorts of notions and ideas onto it, and we think it's fantastic, but, well, we don't know. We simply don't know. And this is why it has such a pull on us. And I remember, just in a very simple and ordinary everyday example, I remember my own teacher, Myokyo-ni, when she was training in Japan. There was a Japanese gentleman there who had learnt English, and he loved to practice English at every opportunity, and would often have foreign students, American or British students, along to stay so that he could speak with them. And Myokyo-ni used to go around quite frequently for tea, and they would chat. And one day he said that he'd recently had some American students visiting him, and they had been visiting at the time of year when there were celebrations for the dead, for the ancestors, and around this time there's the belief on the for this particular festival that the veil between the living and the dead becomes thin, and that the ghosts come amongst the living, and so offerings are made, and so on and so forth. And quite traditionally, a little bit like at our Halloween, there's a telling, there are telling of ghost stories, etc. So he said he'd decided to tell them a ghost story. So they were all sat round, and he began to tell them this story of the old house. It had been abandoned a long time ago. No one had lived there, and gained a reputation for spirits who hung around and lived there. And in that house, the wind used to blow through it, and the chandelier would swing mysteriously backwards and forwards. And he described how from the upstairs would come the sound of slow, ponderous footsteps, and doors would open and close mysterious, and all like this. And he turned to Myokyo-ni at one point, and he said, "And do you know, one of the students turned round to me after I'd finished and said to me, 'But what happened next?' And he said, 'What do you mean, what happens next? This is the ghost story. There's the chandelier that swings backwards and forwards. There's the strange footsteps. There are the doors that open and close of their own, and so on. That is the ghost story. That the way it conjures and evokes that whole sense of the haunted house. What do you need, or what happens next?' But of course we do. We want to know who it is. Is it a ghost? Is it not a ghost? What does the ghost look like? In other words, we're always seeking to concretize that mystery. And to begin with, we have to do that. But in the end, we must let go. And so, now turning to our verse. There are not two Dharmas. Provisionally only has the bull been set up, somewhat in the nature of a signpost. He might also be likened to a snare for catching rabbits, or to a fishing net. Now the herdsman feels as when the shining gold has been separated out from the ore, or when the moon appears from behind a cloud bank. The one cool light has been shining brilliantly since the time before the beginning. So really we have this sense of mystery here too, in the verse. There are not two Dharmas. What are the two Dharmas it's referring to? Well, there's the herdsman, and then there's the bull. And we tend to think that, yes, these are fundamentally real. But they're not. They're concepts. And when we talk about concepts, we need to be careful. We're not just talking about thoughts. A concept is the way we conceive things. In other words, it's the way that we order the sensory data that's coming in. The fact that when I look round this room now, and I see a desk, and I see on the desk, I see some keys, and I see a wallet, and I see a lamp, and there are some plants, and there are some papers, and there's a diary, and a pen, and a computer, obviously, as well. In other words, this conceptualizing, this separating out of one thing from another, and of course we need to do that in order to perceive. And of course there's nothing wrong with that. We couldn't navigate through the world without that. But the problem is that we concretize these concepts and we make them real. Because not only is it that there's some keys there, but they're my keys. And if somebody comes up and takes those away, then my keys have been stolen. Or have they? If it's somebody who's just borrowing my keys, like a friend or something, then it's different. But these are all the way that we conceive of those keys. And we are doing this all the time. The mind is doing this all the time, and not only externally, but also internally. Remember, we've been going through a training process where we began to realize that, sometimes we do and we say things, and we don't know why we've done them, and we maybe even regret them when we've acted impulsively. And I always sort of think, oh, it's my upbringing or something like that. But then through the practice, we begin to realize that there are these elemental forces, these passions, and that we personify these passions in the form of a bull. And that the herdsman represents the aspiration to follow this practice and to come together with that heart. But now we really do become quite concretely aware of these forces within us, that out it pops sometimes. We say or we do something despite my best intentions. And then there's this whole tussle, and then we have the coming together and so forth. And so we can really begin to fall into this idea that there's, on the one side, the aspiration, and on the other side there's this rather rebellious spirit in me, in the heart, that has its own will and seeks to do its own thing from time to time. And we can really get carried along with that. I mean, quite often I've heard students, particularly when they come across the bull and recognize the bull at the beginning of the training, begin to say things like, well, it's the bull that made me do it, rather like our ancestors probably said, well, it was the devil that made me do it. And so sometimes people feel that these elemental forces are devilish, and even evil in some cases. And of course, we have to say, well, no, they're not. They're elemental. They only become evil depending where we're standing in relation to them. It's rather like, and I think maybe this point's been made before, if we see a volcano erupt, if you're far enough away, it's just an elemental force of nature. But if your house is at the bottom of that volcano and it gets destroyed, then it's an angry god, and maybe even an evil god. So these things are dependent upon our relationship to them. So here we have these two dharmas, which are not two dharmas, and in fact, as the verse makes quite clear, they've been set up somewhat in the nature of a signpost. He may be likened, he being the bull, may be likened to a snare for catching rabbits, or to a fishing net. And of course, we have to conceive of him in these ways, because if we don't, then we continue wandering around in the wilderness, never really knowing quite why it is that I fall into this mood, or get carried away with that, and whatever. I remain a complete mystery to myself. And of course, we need that mystery at some point to provoke us to begin to look a little bit more closely at the way we've been going about things. But again, the problem with this conceptualizing, particularly at the beginning, is that we have no reference point, or very little reference point to it. And so I project on all sorts of ideas onto them, onto things like the bull, and also onto things like Buddha as well, and Mara and so forth. I end up projecting a lot onto them. And sooner or later it begins to rub up against reality, and reality doesn't conform with my ideas. And then it's a matter of, well, will I let my cherished opinions and ideas go in defiance of reality, in which case I'll come a cropper? Or if we do let them go, then the the seeing broadens out a little bit. And there's a nice story, again from India, from the Hindu tradition, about the young acolyte who one day is receiving teachings from his guru, and the guru reveals to him the oneness of all things and the inherent nature of God within all things, that God is immanent in everything and in oneself. And the student grasps this for the first time, and he says, "So I am God?" "Yes," said the teacher, "you are God." And he says, "And you are God too, Master?" And he says, "Yes, I am God too. Everything is God." And with this, the young acolyte really gets wafted up. I mean, you know how sometimes that there are certain concepts and certain ideas that seem to have a powerful charge, and when we come across them, it's almost like a physical experience. Well, it is a physical experience. It's like a charge goes through us, and the inherent beauty of these ideas, because ideas do have an aesthetic, captures us completely, as a beautiful piece of music might. And so it is with this young boy. And he goes out, and as he walks round, he looks around, and he goes, "I am God, you are God, everything is God." And he finds himself on the highway, and he's walking along the highway, and coming in the opposite direction is the Maharaja's elephant, dressed up with all his finery. And sitting on the back of the elephant is the Mahout, who's shouting, "Out of the way! Out of the way! Here comes the Maharaja's elephant." And the young student's walking towards him, and he thinks, "I am God." And looking at the elephant, he says, "You are God. Does God get out of the way of God?" "Get out of the way! Out of the way!" shouts the Mahout. "The Maharaja's elephant. I am God. You are God. Does God get out of the way of God?" And a third time, "Out of the way! The Maharaja's elephant. Out of the way. I am God. You are God." And at that moment, the elephant's trunk snakes itself around the young boy, picks him up, and tosses him rather unceremoniously into the dust at the side of the road, and passes on. Well, the young boy gets up, really shaken, completely shaken out of that high, out of that bliss state, and also shocked too, because how could this happen? How could this possibly happen if all things are God? And he goes back to his master, very upset and tearful, and covered now in dust, and says, but you said everything is God." And he explained what had happened, and the old teacher nods and says, "Yes," he said, "it's true, we are all God. But did God listen to the voice of God telling him to get out of the way?" So we have that, these truths are given to us. If we look at that last part here. "Now the herdsman feels as when the shining gold has been separated out from the ore, or when the moon appears from behind a cloud bank. There is that moment of illumination that comes, my goodness. And we think, yes, I understand. And in a sense, we may intuit it. We may even intuit it, that it is so. And of course we do, because if there was no resonance, no connection, no intuition whatsoever, then we would walk right past this stuff. It wouldn't interest us at all. So of course there is a genuine intuition there. There is something genuine there. But of course I conceptualize it and then grasp hold of it and think this is it. And over time, these pretty pictures that we paint about the Dharma and about Buddha and about what is enlightenment, etc., these all have to be put down. These all have to be laid down so that real seeing can open up. The one cool light has been shining brilliantly since the time before the beginning. And this is now something as well that we can ponder and perhaps finish on. This one cool light has been shining brilliantly since the time before the beginning. There is another Zen phrase that says, in the end, when it comes to it, the eyes are still horizontal, the nose is still vertical. And it's true. At the end of the whole thing, what actually has changed, really, apart from the fact we've got a little bit older and maybe a little bit wiser as well. But what has actually changed? In effect, nothing has. And this is the importance and the emphasis that's placed on Buddhism. The Buddha was not about, changing the world or even changing the person per se, but was about awakening to. This is what the title Buddha means, the awakened one, the one who is awake. It's rather like the man who thought he was poor and spent many years grovelling about, begging, in real misery, undergoing starvation and terrible privations. And then one day he comes across somebody that he knew from his youth, and the man says to him, is shocked to see him in this state, this friend, old friend. And he said, but why have you fallen into this? He said, look, he said, don't you know this cloak that you are wearing? You have had it since you were a child, and I can tell you that because I know. He said, there is a jewel sewn up in the hem, look. And he takes hold of the cloak that the beggar is wearing, and running his fingers along the hem at the bottom, they feel the lump. And he shows the man, he said, look, this is what you have had. This is what you have always had. But because you didn't know about it, you couldn't use it, and therefore you fell into poverty because of it. And this is a very poignant allegory for us as well. We're all Buddhas, and we have been Buddhas since the very beginning. That one light has been shining brilliantly, and all things are Buddhas, just as the old guru taught his Chela, his student. But because we do not realize it, because we have fallen into delusion, we think we are ordinary beings, or we think we're criminals, or we think we're high and mighty, or we think, we're continuously conceptualizing, which is fine, but we mistake those conceptualizations for the truth itself, when at best they are only approximations. And of course it's these conceptualizations that I become attached to in the end, and these are the things that I run around and chase after, and fear their loss as well, and that includes of course my own life too. So, but it's not enough just to say, well, now I shan't be worried about it because somebody comes in, sticks a gun to my head. The last thing I remember is some nice talk on Buddhism that we had, or something that I read in a sutra that said all beings are Buddha things. I'm terrified for my life, and I don't want to lose it either. So although even intellectually we may have an appreciation of it, in the heart it's not yet there, and that means that the training still has some way to go before even we reach to this point. But having reached this point at picture number 7, our journey into the truly religious now, into that mystery, we're now on the threshold of it, and so we will see what happens in the next picture. We'll leave it there for now.